What else comes to mind about that moment where Tarver, the indelible image of him starching Roy Jones with the one punch?
Big, massive overhand left. I mean, he had lost the first round on all three scorecards, Tarver, and you thought, okay, maybe Roy's gonna take care of business. Remember, they had fought the first fight. Well, let's back up a little bit. Roy had won the heavyweight title against John Ruiz, had bulked up and had done that business. And then when he couldn't do a fight, they were trying to make it a Vander Holyfield fight. It didn't happen. It got messed up in the end, and they were not able to put the deal together. So he ended up coming back down to the light heavyweight division to fight Tarver in and it was as tough a fight as Jones had ever had. He won close, but he had never been pushed like that. I know he had the DQ loss years earlier against Montel Griffin, but this was easily the one time that Roy looked like he might lose a fight.
And many people believe he lost the fight to Tarver.
Yeah, I don't personally subscribe to that, but the point was he got a really tough fight that night. It was a good fight, and on his worst night, he still showed he had the balls and the heart, and he got through it. He got his hand raised, and but obviously the way that it went, there was a lot of call for a rematch, which he ultimately he didn't probably have to give it to him, but he gave Tarver the fight, and they met again. As you mentioned, 20 years ago was at the Mandalay Bay, and after that first round of Roy, outboxing Tarver pretty handily, Antonio Tarver landed. They had known each other from the amateur days. They were rivals. They were both from the Tampa area. Same, Roy from Pensacola, but they had that Florida thing
Tarver,
going on.
Orlando, and Tampa. He's
Yeah.
now got his home here in Tampa Bay,
But
right?
they had boxed in this similar time coming up as amateurs in those tournaments
Mm-hmm.
together and knew each other well. And Tarver, who's always been a dangerous puncher, especially with the left hand as a southpaw, just landed the most incredible shot you'll ever see and knocked Roy down very, very, very hard, completely knocked him into another dimension. Somehow Roy actually got up and made it beat the count, but he was wobbling all over the place, and
Yep.
the ref was just
Well,
had
we talk
absolutely no
all the
choice
time about the
but to
double
stop it.
impact. His head slammed on the mat,
Yeah.
and that's why he was cuckoo trying to get to his feet and even be there, and the fight's over.
But
He
I
didn't
don't
know.
think people today can understand how shocking this was because whatever you think about what happened in the Tarver first fight, Roy was untouchable. He didn't lose rounds for like years. He'd
Right.
been the pound for pound king of the world for literally a decade. He had risen from middleweight to heavyweight and won titles. He had beaten Bernard Hopkins easily. He had beaten James Toney easily, who was number one on some people's minds pound for pound at that time. He had gone up and dominated in the light heavyweight division, become the undisputed champion, and beaten a lot of top guys. Some crappy guys also, but he had beaten guys like Virgil
Right.
Hill and other credible fighters, Reggie Johnson, Lou Del Val, pick a guy. And he had then taken up because there was no competition for him. He finally went up to heavyweight and fought John Ruiz, who maybe wasn't like the champion, but he was the WBA champion. And he was like at worst, like a top 4 heavyweight at that time. And he didn't just beat him, he routed him. He won easily. It was a masterpiece. And so to see Tarver forget about win, but to knock him out, it wasn't like he got stopped on his feet, got stopped by a cut, essentially went to sleep, even though he did
Shocking.
get to his
Yep.
feet. So that was as stunning as it gets. My thing about that fight, which I remember, is because I was not present in the building that night. Now I had gone to Las Vegas the previous week to cover the first fight between Manny Pacquiao and Juan Manuel Marquez, and was supposed to just stay for the full extra week and then cover Jones and Tarver on this, that next Saturday after back to back Saturdays in Vegas for 2 fights.
Mm-hmm.
I've done that over the period of time, a few different occasions. Unfortunately, right before before the Pacquiao and Marquez fight, my grandmother had passed away.
Mm.
So I went to her funeral in Florida. I came home from that funeral. I packed my shit and I went to Vegas to cover Marquez and Pacquiao. And by the time that had occurred, uh, it was just too much. There was stuff with my family. I had to leave. I just could not stay. I was dealing with too much grief when my grandma hadn't passed, and so I left Vegas and did not stay for that fight. And it's the only time I ever did that. But you have to do what you got to do sometimes. So I did that. I left and I did not stay for that fight. Obviously, I watched the fight on pay per view. I was rather shocked, like everybody else. I certainly did not have that expectation. But so whenever I think about that fight, I think that it was around the time that my grandmother had passed and why I was not there. But it was a very historical victory for Antonio Tarver. And then to make it even more clear that he was the better man, they ultimately had a third fight, and he defeated Roy Jones once again pretty handily, and Roy had gotten
Downtown
knocked out.
Tampa. Downtown. I was not there that night,
I
but
was
I
there for that
remember
one.
you were there. You were there.
Yes,
I was
sir.
not there in downtown Tampa when he beat Roy in a 12-round decision. But I'm just
But
saying
remember,
again.
remember between the knockout of the second fight that we're talking about and the one-sided decision he took in the third fight, Roy had followed up the Tarver knockout by getting absolutely pummeled and destroyed and knocked out even worse by Glenn Johnson when they met later in 2004. And basically, Tarver finished Roy his career as a top fighter, and Glenn Johnson kicked dirt on it. And even though Roy and then Tarver, whatever, he finished him completely in the third fight. And amazingly, from 2005, after the third Tarver fight, when Roy was basically left for dead following two losses to Antonio Tarver and the destruction against Glenn Johnson, he actually fought for another, up until another 10 years, more than 10 years. He
Yes.
never, he beat like an aging Felix Trinidad who would come out of retirement and fought him at light heavyweight. And he beaten like a couple other guys. He had lost lopsidedly to Calzaghe, but he continued to fight. He beat like a Lacey and a Omar Shika, but he never was at the top level. And he was getting knocked out by guys. He got drilled by Danny Green in Australia in a fight that people forget about because it was so far away and wasn't really known here. He didn't show up and add absolutely nothing. I actually went to this fight when he fought Bernard Hopkins in the rematch, and he got just toyed with, which was sad to see. A fight that nobody really cared about. Anyway, he played out the string, but his career basically ended as a meaningful fighter in retrospect on the night that Tarver knocked him out in the second round. And Roy Jones, prior to that, is one of the greatest fighters I've ever seen. I say it all the time, best fighter I ever covered in terms of his overall talent, first ballot Hall of Famer. Just phenomenal,
And we keep
phenomenal fighter.
conveying this again for the newbies, the Gen Z, and whatever that think again that boxing began in 2009. The guy was virtually untouchable, and that's what made this so shocking that Tarver touched him up after that epic moment where they don't really allow that anymore. Trash talk on the PA, but Tarver cracked off the line. You got because the referee, whoever it was, said,
I'll tell you
"Do
who it
you
was.
have any?" Who was it?
It was
Who?
well, I'll tell you. So it was Jay Nady.
All right, so
Now
Jay
Jay
Nady
Nady
says, "Do you have any questions?" And
and then
Tarver
Tarver.
says, "You got any excuses tonight, Roy?"
Well, no, he
Just
first no
deadpan.
first he said, "Yeah, I got a question.
You
You
got.
got an excuse tonight, Roy?" But then the follow up that made it even more so fucking classic was Jay Nady answered him going, "No, we're not going to ask questions like that."
and then and then he ended it with the big punch. Tarver time, still knocking around, still on the golf courses in North Tampa, by the way.